Welcome to the Great White North. Okay, so like our topic today is Manure Monday, manure additives. Okay, so like if you have manure in a tank and you want to add something, I'd recommend you add some beer because like beer will help with the fermentation process, right? But the key thing is it can't be any beer. It has to be Canadian beer because like American beer is not strong enough. So Canadian beer into your manure tank, that's the best manure additive. Okay, take off, hosers. All right, forgive me, everybody. I just could not resist on a beautiful wintry day here in the Great White North like today. Just couldn't help but do a throwback to the 80s to our good old friends, Bob and Doug McKenzie in the Great White North. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, it means you're probably under 30 years old. So check it out. Go to YouTube and Google or do a search for the Great White North, and you'll be able to have some time well wasted. So here we are back to March Manure Mondays, and thank you for joining us. We've had a couple of great sessions. This is session 3, and yes, our topic today is manure additives. So last week, we talked about manure application logistics. We had a couple of farmers, custom operators from Ontario who were looking at how to be more efficient and practical in your spreading, when, where, why, and how. Great discussion. That session has also been posted, and so it's there on our YouTube channel. That's the Omafra Field Crop News YouTube channel. Check it out. We've had a lot of people have looked at the first session we did, the sand-laden manure. So I encourage you to circle back to that one as well. So here today, you know the gig, it's the usual. Please stay muted, but lots of conversation in the chat. Post your questions there, your comments there. And for starters today, being as our topic is additives, if you are a farmer and you are using some type of manure additive, please post that in the chat. What are you using and why? And is it working? If you're an industry person, this is an opportunity for a shameless plug. Put that in the chat. What are you selling? What's the product? What is it supposed to do? If you're a researcher or whatever your gig and you've had any work at all with additives, post that there because today we're going to have a conversation about this. So let's jump in, and I want to introduce our speaker today. And we're very pleased to have Dan Andersen with us. Dan is from Iowa State University. And in talking to Dan, basically he sees his job as being somebody who can help people deal with their issues around manure. So that's pretty broad, but pretty helpful too. Dan comes at it not only from the academic perspective, of course, at Iowa State University, but also from the farm perspective. He is a farm boy himself. He grew up on a small dairy farm. And so, Dan, you're ready to go here. I'm going to turn it over to you, but I want you to start by answering my question, which is, when you grew up, what was considered a small dairy farm?
What was a small dairy farm when I grew up? Well, we milked 40 cows, and I would say we were a small dairy farm. We were the smallest one on the road. Uh, and by the time my dad quit, he was one of the smallest dairy farmers still in Wisconsin. And we actually milked with a bucket and transfer system. So all the fun envy of people with pipelines when I was little, and now we get to look at milking parlors or robotic milkers, and the world just seems so much different. But I still wouldn't trade it for the world. But we were a small dairy farm when I was growing up even. Which is why I don't get to milk cows and I have to talk about crap for a living now. All right, today's topic was manure additives. I will admit that I originally put this together for something called the Air Management Practices Assessment Tool. So shameless plug, if you Google Air Management Practices Assessment Tool, you'll find an Iowa State webpage where we tried to list a bunch of different practices that might help with odor in some cases and put out information on that. So if you're interested in what are options for odor control? It's not quite as new as it used to be, but I think a lot of it still remains relevant. All right, so just a little bit of a definition to get us all on the same page. I'm going to define a manure additive as any substance that we're going to put in the manure to try and achieve something. And I know that a lot of companies will sell additives that they say do everything, but hopefully we're picking them with some objective in mind. Like I have a deep pit cattle facility. It has a crust. In the past, when I've agitated this manure and tried to break that crust, I've had hydrogen sulfide issues. So I'm looking for a product that will help reduce crusting on the manure. Or maybe I've been using this barn for a long time. I have a lot of sludge that's built up in the bottom of the pit, and when we come to agitate, I just can't get it out. So I need a product that helps with the sludge. And then there's a few other things that people might say, right? They might make nutrients more available, and certainly we can have a discussion of that, but availability of nutrients is important. And if you think about like what's an additive going to do to change that, it probably means it's breaking down some of the carbon and putting it in a more plant available form. Or maybe it just means that we're reducing ammonia loss somehow by this product that we're using. And really, there's a few ways that it can do that, right? It could alter chemical, physical, or maybe microbial properties of the manure. And hopefully we're doing this in some semi-intelligent way. I'd like to say, I think in the last 10 years that I've been looking at this, we've gotten better at maybe what some of that intelligent might be, or how to design projects to do that. But I think oftentimes they've still been sort of guess and check, like, we want a product to do this, let's make this stuff, throw it in and see if anything happens. And if it doesn't, we'll modify it a little bit. And if it does, well, kudos to us, we made it work. But I think there's a lot of options out there. We're going to try and talk about some classes, how you might think about what they might do, how they might work, why they might work, and then what some of the struggles might be. I get a fair number of questions about additives, and I've thought long and hard about why are additives so popular. I think oftentimes maybe in the manure world we look towards there's other things that we might want to do rather than just an additive, things like solid separation or anaerobic digestion. And there are a lot of big ticket items that really cause substantial changes to things, right? And the idea, or at least the appeal of additives to me is, well, we get to live with the infrastructure we have, and we're just going to do something that's hopefully relatively easy to do, either put this product in annually every time we pump, maybe monthly or weekly in some cases, but it doesn't require a big capital investment. Instead, it's more of an ongoing, we're just going to have to buy this thing to add into our manure. And there's an appeal to that, right? It's a lot of business as usual, farm like we get to farm, and we're going to put something in to try and improve one of those issues, whether it be ammonia retention so we have more fertilizer value, odor control, or just that solids breakdown to help with pumpability and usability, or getting rid of a crust so we don't have as many flies to deal with. I tried to think about how to divide this as we're going to talk about it and think about what things might do. And I try to think about additives in classes, or the type of thing that we're adding. And the reason I do that is I get calls all the time from a company. Can you test this, or can you test that, or what do you think about this product? And sometimes I've never heard of them. And I want to get some understanding about, like, what do I think it could potentially do and why? Or if I'm going to have to answer a farmer question about it, like, I don't know that product. I don't know anything about it. I can't say yes, it works, or no, it doesn't. But what can I tell you that might be helpful, useful to think about, or a mechanism behind why it may or may not work? So the first two there, I'm going to kind of group together, and they're microbial inoculants and enzymes. And really, when I think about what those are, we're trying to add bacteria in the manure. And that might sound funny, right? When manure is excreted from an animal, there's already lots of bacteria in it. Why would we try and put something else in it to help us either break down solids or do something different? And it's because, well, it turns out an animal gut and the manure storage are substantially different in sort of what might live there and who might live there. With that said, both those products can have some struggles, right? Just because we throw a bacteria in doesn't mean it's going to become the predominant type of bacteria in that situation, or even substantially change what's happening there, right? When I think about how much bacteria is in manure, we might talk about something like 10 to the 8th colony forming units per 100 milliliters of manure. And that doesn't mean a lot other than it's a big number. But when you think about that and say, well, I've got this concentrated product I'm going to throw in, there's a lot of stuff already there that we have to deal with, right? To change microbial community, to change what's happening. So when we talk through those classes in more detail later, I think that's one of the things to think about is how much are they asking me to put in to cause long-lasting change? Enzymes are sort of the same way, except we're skipping the bacteria step, right? Normally when we're putting in a bacteria, we're hoping they're going to make an enzyme to help break something up. For instance, with microbial inoculants, you might hear about something like bacillus, and people like bacillus because there's a lot of good research that shows it makes something called a protease. And Proteases are things that break down proteins. Well, animals excrete some proteins. Proteins probably help bond manure crust together. If we can break down those proteins, we're in good shape. And adding an enzyme directly sort of skips that step. We don't have to do the bacteria. We're going to add something we know effectively changes something right away, right? So why add a bacteria that we hope grows when we could just throw in a protease? Well, if I throw in an enzyme, it's got some effective life before it'll be broken down. If I throw in that bacteria and it does cultivate, hopefully it keeps making the enzyme for me in the future. And then there's a few other classes. I'm going to include acidifiers in here, and I think acidifiers are an interesting one. You could say that's not really a manure additive, that's a whole class by itself, right? And I won't dispute that, but especially in things like poultry litter, you might see products like Clasp or other sort of additives where really that's what they're doing, is they're really trying to acidify that litter slightly. We know that by acidifying it, it's going to hold on to ammonia better, right? And in manure, liquid manures, it's the same thing. If we can make the pH slightly more acidic, slightly lower, good chance that we're going to reduce ammonia emissions. And I think you could say, well, acidification is something different. It means we get to a pH of below X. But a lot of these additives might not get us to that number, but they still have some impact of the acid. Oxidizers would be throwing in something that we know helps really add oxygen to the manure breakdown mechanism. And you could think of things like hydrogen peroxide, soybean peroxidase, or if you wanted to expand that definition a little bit, there's been a fair amount of research on using ozone. And when you think about breakdown products, if you're in aerobic conditions, we're going to mostly turn carbon molecules into CO2. And the advantage of that is, well, CO2 doesn't smell like anything. In an anaerobic condition, so without oxygen, we're going to make mostly CO2 and methane, but we get a whole bunch of byproducts, right? Volatile fatty acids, endols, scadols, things that didn't decompose all the way down to their most reduced form. And essentially, these oxidizers are supposed to take any of that stuff, that easily degradable stuff that is a byproduct, and break it down quickly so we'll turn it into hopefully CO2 and remove some of the odor, right? And there's some work that shows they can be successful, but again, I think when you think about manure, man, there's a lot of organic material in it, depending on what type of manure, more than others sometimes, but there's a lot of organic matter in it. And to really be effective, we probably have to break down a lot of that organic matter, or whatever oxidizer we're throwing in really needs to target the specific compounds we're worried about. And one of the things you're going to hear me say over and over again is target, right, or specificity. And many of our oxidizers aren't that specific. They just break down whatever organic matter they come into contact with, right? So if you had hydrogen peroxide and you pour it on your cut, it's not saying, I know that's a disease molecule, right? I want to break that down. It's just reacting with almost everything. And that'll be one of the challenges that oxidizers used in manure would have. Sorbents, I think we can classify into two parts. And really what I mean by a sorbent is it's just something sticky that certain types of molecules would want to stick to. One of the most popular ones to think about is ammonia, right? So ammonia or ammonium, generally, NH4 with a plus sign, tends to be sticky. It wants to stick to things with negative charges. And we found a lot of things out there that can carry a negative charge. Some natural sorbents might be clay particles, things like zeolites. And then we've manufactured a lot of polymer substances, and that polymer in many ways is like a fly paper, right? It's going to get a charge, oftentimes by having hydrogens on it. It'll donate the hydrogen out to solution, maybe acidifying the manure slightly, but really it's trying to make something that has a lot of negative charge sites on it, and then things with a positive charge hopefully stick to it. If you have a targeted compound, right? Like if I designed that sorbent really well, maybe it can go out and seek out ammonia. On the other hand, there's lots of competing positively charged ions in manure, calcium, potassium, sodium. So if it's not specific for looking for that ammonia, it might be just absorbing a lot of different compounds. And while it's effective, it has a lot of holding space. It doesn't hold the thing we actually want. So we have to overdose to find maybe the reaction that we want. Another one would be precipitants. So this is just throwing in a salt of some type that hopefully causes a reaction where it binds and we can settle it out. And in some cases you might say, that's bad. I already have sludge. I don't want more sludge. Why would I want something to settle to the bottom? And the answer would be, you probably don't. But maybe in other cases, precipitating something out is useful. And one I think about there is phosphorus, right? And we see in human wastewater treatment systems, sometimes people add alum, aluminum salt, or ferric, an iron salt, and that can help precipitate some of that phosphorus. It'll stick to the iron and settle down, and maybe that gives us a product that's more amenable to land application for whatever reason. And then there's products that have multiples of these mechanisms working together, right? But anytime you see a product, what I try and do when I hear a product I don't know is, can I look up what it is and try and figure out which class it falls in? And by knowing what class it falls in, I can maybe say it has more likelihood to be doing this or that, right? So if it's a microbial product, right, where we're adding it in and it's microbes, I'm probably saying, well, it's trying to change the microbial population. It's probably trying to provide some new enzymes. That probably relates to solids breakdown. If it's an acidifier, I might say, okay, that's probably a product that's more tailored to ammonia retention in the manure. Or if it's a sorbent, that might be, well, I want ammonia to stick to it, right? So by knowing the class, you can sort of get in your head, maybe these are the mechanisms or things that it might be trying to achieve. And I say that because when you look up the label, oftentimes it's going to say, I do get rid of crusting, I get rid of sludge, I hold on to more nitrogen, I also make the nutrients more available. And what I'm trying to get at is many times there's competing reactions there, right? It's hard to do everything. For example, if one of your ideas is it makes the nutrients more available, that probably means we broke down organic matter, right? So we've turned organic nitrogen into ammoniacal nitrogen, which might be ammonia or ammonium. But if we're doing that, the ammoniacal nitrogen concentration in the manure is now higher. That probably makes the pH slightly more basic, right? Because ammonia is a weak base. And it also probably leads to a situation where, since there's just more ammonia in it, we're going to get slightly higher ammonia emissions from the manure, because ammonia emissions are generally proportional to how much ammonia is in the manure. So it's hard to sometimes achieve all of these objectives, and you need multiple mechanisms to make that happen. Okay. I made a list of reasons for additives. I'm sure if you start thinking about it, you can come up with a bunch more, but these are typically what I hear people talking about, either sludge breakdown and reduced crusting, things related to maybe agitation or pumping, right? If we break down sludge, hopefully that manure pumps a little bit easier, or is maybe more uniform, people might say, just because it doesn't have a distinct difference between what we're normally pumping and then hitting something that's really sludgy at the bottom. One that I've dealt more with is foam control, since we had a lot of foaming issues in manure not too long ago in Iowa. And then the third one is probably related to nutrients. People look at manure and say, value added product, I'm going to recycle nutrients. What are ways I can improve that? So holding on to more nitrogen, or potentially making nutrients more available for whatever reason. And then the final one is odor control. And it turns out that a fair amount of the testing that I've got to do before is related to that odor control. It's something that I think people are interested in and want, but it's also something that's hard to spend money on. All right, so we're going to dive into microbial additives to start with. And I will fully admit that I got this slide from Laura Pepple back when she worked at the University of Illinois, and we started doing some microbial sampling from the manure. And really what we do is we get a manure sample, we extract all the DNA from it, and then based on a certain region of that DNA, you can do basically a census of what's in the manure. What are the microbes that are there? It's not perfect, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what DNA is floating around in the manure. And then this graph on the bottom is really to help you understand how I'm going to plot a lot of those results or talk about them. And it's really a strange plot. I hated it the first time I saw it. But what you can take away from it is if you see 2 points that are close together, those manures have very similar microbial communities or microbial census. So it might be people who live there are all roughly the same age is one way to think about it, right? And if the two plots are very far apart on the graph, they're more different from each other. So if I was to perform a census of people, it might be, well, old people live in this neighborhood and young people live in this neighborhood for whatever reason, except in this case, it's going to be with microbes, right? They're very different. And I think when you think about manure additives and maybe where science has progressed the most rapidly, our ability to cheaply cultivate and understand the microbial community in a manure storage is something that's really developed in the last 10 years. Hopefully that'll lead to more targeted designs for some of these additives, but it at least maybe lets us quantify how we're changing the manure under certain conditions. So with any microbial additive, I think what I normally think of we're trying to do is break down solids, right? We're trying to alter reaction rates By doing so, maybe we can turn more of that organic material, that carbon, into CO2 and methane rather than making some byproducts. We won't have as many solids there, but we're also going to turn more of that organic nitrogen into ammonical nitrogen, right? That's really what you're trying to do. And where I wanted to start on that is sort of you are what you eat, right? So this is some work I did. On the right there, you can see we fed pigs different diets. Just for abbreviation purposes, corn SBM would be corn soybean meal-based ration. A corn DDGS would be a corn distiller's grain ration with a little soybean meal in it, but predominantly distillers for the protein. And then a diet that we feed a lot less of here in Iowa would be a corn soy hull soybean meal diet. But I was trying to get some various fiber sources, right? So I have 3, and then that second abbreviation, either the C or F, is just a designation for how fine I ground the feed, right? So fine would be about 350 microns. Coarse would have been about 700 microns. And as you can probably estimate, the coarser you ground the feed, maybe the pig did a less good job of digesting it. So coarse ground feeds tended to end up with more solids than manure. Fine ground feeds tended to end up with less carbon in the manure, more absorbed by the pig. And then on the left there, I have that sort of microbial impact of that. So when I look at this, those blue and green dots are the corn soybean meal or corn distillers, right? Sort of diets, and they sort of fall together. And then the soybean meal diet falls separate from that, right? So what I took away from that is different fiber sources led to different microbial communities. So if you're thinking about a manure additive and saying, can I impact the manure? Yeah, right. If certainly at a large scale, if we're feeding different things, we can influence it. And then I saw a carbon gradient, right? So less carbon near the top, and as I get more carbon in the manure, you'd move more downward on that graph. Now, that's a microbial community, and you might say, what does that really mean? What's it doing? And unfortunately, I get to say, man, it's tough to link microbial community to different traits of the manure, right? That's a work in progress. From some of the work that I was involved in that we did link it to a few things, right? So here I have 3 different manure surfaces, either a foamy manure, so it had bubbles on the top of at least 6 inches. The orange would be sort of crusted manures, and the green would be no crusted manures. And you have to squint a little bit, but they sort of relate to the microbial community in that manure. Now, does that mean the microbial community causes that surface condition, a crust or a foam? Not necessarily, although I'm going to argue probably strongly related to it, but it's definitely correlated to it, right? So maybe if we had a different microbial community, we wouldn't have made a crust. All right, I wanted to continue on sort of that vein. One product that I played with is Andersen. It's sold under the trade name Skyces. A lot of companies have started adding it to the manure products around here because they said it did something for foam. We were on the leading edge of that. We played with it and said, does it help reduce methane? And I did that because methane was related to foam. So my control manure is right there at the top. It's always going to be 100, right? So it made X amount of methane, and that's all that represents. And then I did various dosing rates of Andersen in the manure, right? And you can see that by throwing in different dosing rates of Andersen, I was able to reduce the amount of methane coming out of the manure. So that says to me that, well, the product did something functionally for me, right? It made a change. And then this graph is almost the same thing, except instead of just showing a picture and saying the dots are so far apart, there's a number you can calculate, the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity, which basically tells you how far the dots are apart. So I had 3 different farms of manures, right? Farm A, Farm B, Farm C, just 3 swine farms. I went and got manure. I hit them with different rates of Andersen, and then I'm plotting how different the control that I didn't treat with Andersen was from those I dosed with Andersen. The more I treated, more Andersen I added to that manure, the more I was able to alter the microbial community. And you might say, why are you showing me this? What does this have to do with the microbial additive? Well, it's supposed to show you there is potential to change the microbial community of the manure, right? In these cases, we definitely changed the microbial community on all 3 farms, statistically significant changes. But you might also notice that one farm was much more responsive to change than the other 2 farms. Why is that? Unfortunately, I can't say. Now, I also wanted to point this graph out where we did almost the same thing, right? They're the same 3 farms. There's my controls. There's my Andersen treatment. But I also just threw sugar in, right? I was able to change the microbial community just as much by adding sugar as I was with adding Andersen. Now, Andersen is a nice additive for me because I get to know something about it. It works on a certain microbe. Sugar, I have no idea what it does other than it adds a different carbon source. But it also made an impact, right? And then if I did both of them together, the impact was even bigger than just the 2 alone. All this to say, I think there's a good chance that microbial additives can change the microbial community of the manure. They can be effective in that way. The harder part is knowing if they're doing something useful or if we're just making change for change's sake, right? Because we don't have linkages between many of the different types of organisms and the amount of odor the manure makes. Or I have weak linkages between microbial community and when there's crusting or not. Um, so that's going to handle what I had to say about microbial additives. I think it's a world that's evolving. Pyrosequencing becoming cost effective, $5 to $10 per sample that you send, is something that will allow a lot more work in this area and hopefully facilitate targeted design. With that said, the one time I tried targeted design, it didn't work as well for me. I knew what I wanted to achieve. I wanted to break down proteins, added a bacillus bacteria, and I couldn't get it to cultivate the manure any more than my control, right? So it can work, but your mileage may vary based on what your initial microbial community is for the manure and probably what you do to cause a disruption for where it might cultivate. So if you want it to be as effective as possible, starting early, right after you agitated and remove manure, right? So you have this little manure as possible, is probably the time to start treating. You just caused a major change in their habitat where they're living, and it's more susceptible to change. Okay, our second class is sorptive additives, and I just put this picture out here for fun. This is our odor testing setup. So we have something like 16 PVC columns. Each one will hold roughly 40 gallons of manure, and then we continuously run air to ventilate that headspace where we can take ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, or other samples that we run through a GC for odor analysis, right? So in order to do this in controlled ways, I think you need a setup similar to this, right, where it's pretty controlled. Just seeing if they work outside in a barn offers you something, but it's more of a before and after, and sometimes the manure can change in addition to that. So we've had the opportunity to play with a few different products in that setup, actually quite a few products, but one I'm showing here is a product called zeolite. We use specifically clinoptilolite. And zeolites have been used a long time in wastewater treatment, drinking water treatment, because people know that ammonia loves to stick to their surface, right? So if you can get ammonia to stick to this solid particle, well, then it's not going to be available to go into the air to become a lost compound. So that's nitrogen fertilizer that we're retaining in the manure, right? And it's also an odor that we don't have going on. In this case, I have two different manure types here. One I got from a facility that had a crust on it, one I got from a facility that didn't have a crust. And in both cases, you can see that by adding the zeolite, I was able to reduce the ammonia emissions from the manure, right? So a good sign that it's working. I took that as it was working, but you could also say, is that really what I want to do? I added a particle that probably is going to settle to the bottom and increase sludge, right? So there was a trade-off. I got rid of some ammonia. I'm holding on more of that nitrogen in the manure. I reduced odor emissions slightly, and I made a little bit more sludge in that manure from it, right? So most products can do something, but they all might not do everything. One of the other ones we played around with was biochar, and I see we have a question about would adding biochar to horse manure be useful. In this case, we added biochar to pig manure, and specifically we were doing it around the time of agitation, right? And when we agitate manure, stir it or mix it, we know that it's prone for lots of compounds coming off the manure. More ammonia will come off the manure than normal. More hydrogen sulfide will come off the manure than normal. And our hypothesis was that biochar is sort of hydrophobic. It'll float on the top, and it makes this almost like a crust or a filter that the air that's coming out of the manure has to flow through before it leaves. And biochar has lots of functional units, so things can absorb to it, right? And that's generally what we saw. If we had biochar added to the manure, we had less ammonia loss during agitation. We also had less hydrogen sulfide loss during agitation, right? So it was pretty effective at reducing that peak on the curve there. So I'm showing the green one would be our treated, the red would be our untreated, and it brought that peak down so we had less emissions. It was sticking to that biochar. Adding biochar to horse manure, can it be useful? Yes, but I'm going to make a few more qualifying comments on that, right? So with horse manure, you're really talking about a solid manure. And what are we trying to achieve? I think one thing you might say is, well, it's solid manure, but I can smell ammonia coming off it, right? And if you don't like that ammonia smell coming off it, adding biochar probably will absorb some of that ammonia. You'd have less ammonia or odor and potentially more fertilizer value. There's other ways to handle that, right? Though. So for instance, with horse manure, if you would use a little bit more bedding, you'd probably have it slightly drier. Generally, drier bedded packs do a better job of holding onto that nitrogen. So there's certain things it can do, but it's not a magic cure-all. It will hold on to more of the nitrogen, more of the phosphorus. Different bedding management can also influence that as well, right? So there's multiple ways to get at that. With that said, I played around with biochar during composting of some bedded pack beef cattle manure. In general, I had less ammonia come off the compost pile when I added biochar compared to where I didn't. I added something like 2% of my dry matter weight in biochar, so it was a fair amount of biochar, but I did see a significant reduction, and it still composted just fine for me. Another one that we played around with, this is very similar to what we did with the zeolite study, except it was a product called More Than Manure. More Than Manure is a polymer product, so I'd like to think of it as fly paper, right? It's going to have a lot of, in this case, negative charge sites on it. So you put it in, it gives off a fair amount of hydrogen, then it wants to have positive ions absorbed to it. In this case, we had sort of the same setup. We had an uncrusted control, an uncrusted treatment, a crusted control, a crusted treatment, and then a double dose of that, right? And on my uncrusted manure, it didn't seem to do a whole lot for me, but on my crusted manure, I saw a significant difference in the amount of ammonia that came off by adding this product. Same sort of similar trend with hydrogen sulfide emissions, right? I saw in general a trend of decreasing with treatment, not necessarily definitive, but at least a trend that it was working in that direction. I wanted to make a couple comments on those products because I get a fair number of comments from farmers about them. They often say, when I throw in this polymer, and you can see Triune or More Than Manure videos online, I get a really impressive reaction. What's happening there? That's got to be good, right? And I think it is a good sign that something's happening, but what it really means is a little harder, right? So you can watch that product spread out across the manure and it looks very impressive. Well, it has an extremely negative charge, so it wants to react with something with a positive charge, so it moves seeking those out. It's also generally slightly acidic, so when you throw it in, you get a fair amount of bubbling. That bubbling is probably mostly CO2 bubbles coming off. CO2 bubbles will come off when you acidify something, right? Because you've changed the pH of the manure and made it less soluble. And maybe those bubbles are good. They might help break up a crust or re-wet a crust. They might help move some of that sludgy material from the bottom to get it more suspended back in the manure. With that said, when it looks really impressive when they add it to a manure storage. When I do these tests at lab scales, oftentimes we end up adding extremely small amounts, milliliters, to a tank of manure, and you don't get that sort of violent reaction because there's not that much material coming through. So some of the characteristics I think might work better. Like if that bubbling really does help mix your manure, provide some agitation, I think there's a good chance it can. I don't see that at the lab scale when I do my test. We also know that crusts cause reductions in ammonia emissions, right? So if you throw something like Triune or More Than Manure on it, you get a lot of bubbling and you move some material to the surface, these bubbles with some solid particles in it. Well, that's almost like a crust or a physical barrier between the manure and the air. There's a good chance that it can lower ammonia emissions. Now, how much does it lower ammonia emissions? Well, it depends, right? What's the airspeed over that manure? What was happening? What were the characteristics before? But they can do something, and the question I start asking is, I can see what it is where I put it in, and if I had an outdoor manure storage, I can see it all over, but it's hard to see the entire surface of a deep pit. Is that happening all over? I wanted to make a little bit more comment on sorbents. There is some people who do work on sorbents and try and say, can we use them to separate nutrients from manure? This is just two examples of this with zeolite and with a biochar, right? So both cases trying to hold on to some of that nitrogen, that ammonia. One of the things that they saw and people generally see is that there's lots of other stuff in manure, right? So if I take pure water with a known amount of ammonia on it, you get these yellow diamond sort of lines, right, where sorption is probably generally better than what we see in this manure because that carbon in the manure, all that other stuff in manure competes for those binding sites. So while we might think it's great, right, it's a product that we know can do something, can work, in manures it gets more complicated because there's lots of competing reactions. I did want to comment on acidifiers. This is just some examples in poultry barns showing there a product clasp and also a product alum being sprayed on the litter, right? And those are pH amendments. We know that pH plays a strong role in how much ammonia might come off the manure. Depending on the pHs we reach, we can also do lots of other things like reduce methane emissions or kill some of the pathogens in manure, right? So the dose response mechanism gets to be really important here, but there is science that says they can probably do something some of the time. Oftentimes when we're buying an additive from a company, it might not change the pH enough to really drop it to a pH of 4 or 5, where we might think about it killing everything off. But this was a really interesting study to me because they added different rates of sulfuric acid there, and in many cases they didn't change the pH of the manure much at all. This was a liquid manure, liquid dairy manure in this case. But even though they didn't change the pH of the manure much at all, you can still see an impact on how much methane came out of the manure or how much ammonia came out of the manure, right? So you might not get as much efficacy as you want. You might not say, I was able to reduce carbon methane emissions by 70% or ammonia emissions by 30%, but there is some impact of that uh, in how it works. I did want to comment that other people have tried just treating maybe the residual manure with acidifiers, and they tend to say that can be relatively effective as well, right? It's maybe stuff that has already been cultivated by different types of bacteria, and if we acidify that enough, we can really disrupt the microbial community and sort of make it start over. And since the animal gut is much warmer than the manure storage, if we make it start over with very few microbes or active microbes left in it, we tend to get things to happen more slowly, right? Because we got rid of some of that mechanism for breakdown. Now, from a nutrient loss perspective, how much ammonia it's making or losing, how much methane it's making, you might say those are good things, right? I got rid of I made less methane, so my greenhouse gas footprint's lower. I reduced my ammonia volatilization. I have more nitrogen than manure. Great. But there's a price to pay to that, right? We threw in acid, we've slowed the breakdown of solids, and we're going to end up probably with something that has a higher solids content when we take it out on the back end. And then there's some other classes, things like oxidizers, those precipitants we talked about, and maybe microbial inhibitors, right? And I think there's been a fair amount of work on this, but also not a lot of strong science. This product worked this well, this product didn't work that well. One oxidizer that one of my colleagues here at Iowa State worked with was soybean peroxidase. This is just a picture looking inside that tube. Essentially, it was this powdery product, right, that you would put on top of your manure. The idea is the odorants flow through it or past it, they have free oxygen they can donate to help break down some of those volatile organic compounds that are coming by, hopefully reducing odor that's coming out as a result of it. He had good luck with it, and the hard part about it when we're done is you have to ask yourself, well, did it really oxidize those odorants, or was this partially a crusting effect where less of the manure is exposed to the moving air over top, and we weren't losing as much nutrient just because of that? And it's probably the truth is somewhere in between, right? It's a combination of both. But that's one of the hard part about additives, right? I like to think about them as classes and how they might be performing, but oftentimes there's multiple mechanisms at play, and some of those mechanisms might be competing. For example, if I offered this to a swine farmer to use, he might say, well, I like the idea of less odor, but you kind of made a crust on top, and now I'm worried about flies or more rats being able to run on the top of that manure storage because I have a thicker crust. What do you think is going to happen there? And the answer is yes, right? If I make this and I get a crust, there's a chance for more flies because that's where fly larvae tends to be able to procreate. So there's really a trade in many of these. So you have to think about what's your problem and what I'm trying to accomplish. Precipitants are the same way. I think in this case, we know a lot of what precipitants can do. There's a lot of good data on especially metal salts related to trying to remove phosphorus from the manure, at least from the liquid fraction of the manure, but oftentimes they're just transforming it down into the sludge below where it's a problem that we might have to deal with later. If you're looking for a summary of at least a fair number of products, something like 15 that were tested, Jacek Kozil did this study back in 2017 through 2020. I know Purdue has done another study. And oftentimes those products didn't show statistical differences. So I wanted to make a few comments about what you might find there and where they're going. In general, the level of performance you can achieve with a different additive varies greatly. It depends on the manure you're starting with and what that product is really trying to do. I think anywhere from no impact at all up to somewhere in that 50-60% range is probably achievable for many things. It's doubtful that one product can handle all of our problems. Like we talked about, many times they're competing, right? If I'm going to break down more solids, chances are I'm probably going to cause more ammonia to be in the manure, and that generally leads to more ammonia emissions. So when I think about products, What I normally say is many of them are based on sound mechanisms for altering the manure. I think we have data these days that says that you can alter the microbial community. We certainly have data that says if you have less ammonia in the manure, so if you add a sorbent and can hold on to some of that ammonia nitrogen, you'll have less ammonia available to come out of the manure. So oftentimes these products are based on at least some of these mechanisms. Trying to understand which ones it's using is helpful for understanding why it might be effective in your case or might not be. I think oftentimes those products can be effective in certain conditions, but they probably won't be effective at all manure conditions. And then the last thing I'd point out is more specificity on the product, both of what it's trying to do and what it's targeting, are extremely helpful, right? So if I have a product that I want to use to reduce ammonia emissions, have more ammonia retention than manure, the more it can react just with ammonia, the better off I'm going to be. And the reason I say that is because many times products, in order to be viable from an economic standpoint, try and minimize their dosing rates. And a lot of the science says many of these mechanisms can be effective, but you have to get to dosing rates where they can be effective, right? And that's sort of a balance of the science works or the dollars work. And sometimes it's hard to make them both be true, especially if you can't maybe put value on something like the value of odor reduction. Certainly there is from a neighbor relations perspective, but it doesn't put any more money in your pocketbook necessarily. So that's where I had before we get to questions today. If you would like copies of the slides, just let me know. I'd be happy to send them to you. Otherwise, I'm going to try and answer some of the questions. If you have a question, happy to take it. Otherwise, I see one more on the horse manure is aged, has been covered with hay, and will be spread over the planting area. I'm working with a fruit tree orchard. So that was related to the adding biochar to the manure. So there's a couple things going on with that question. One, what are we hoping to achieve by adding biochar after it's been aged? I would guess that that manure, if it's aged well, probably doesn't have much of an odor concern. Maybe it still has some ammonia in it, but it's probably relatively low. So adding biochar at that point maybe could provide you a little more odor control if you still feel that is a challenge. But really, if you're adding biochar, maybe at that point, it's specific to what's my concern at land application, and then some belief or feeling about how manure and biochar would impact soil health. And I don't really want to talk about that today. I think there's good work that shows that biochar can positively influence soil health. But from that question, in terms of using it as a manure additive, there's probably not a whole lot left that you're trying to achieve. You've probably gotten to most of what the benefits are going to be. So there, it was a soil health question. I think, again, it depends on your initial soil characteristics, but there's good work that shows that biochar will increase soil water retention. It tends to reduce bulk density of soil, all things that tend to be positive. With that said, I don't want to make biochar sound perfect either. It oftentimes comes with more concentrated heavy metals, right? We took something that was relatively carbon rich. We've processed it into something that still has a lot of carbon, but you've increased the metal content of that just because the metals had nowhere else to go. So there's a lot of trade-offs in that, but I think generally it's probably helpful for soil health. And if you have that biochar laying around, I like to mix biochar with anything before I land apply it because it is dusty as heck, has been my experience when you just try and apply it. So if your manure is a little wet, it at least makes it so you don't have to deal with the biochar dust, and that's a benefit for me. What are my thoughts on pit additives that claim to increase nutrient value? Well, let's start with potassium. That's the easiest one. There is no mechanism to increase potassium values from a pit additive, right? Potassium is extremely soluble. Whatever the animal excreted, we should be able to mostly get out of that manure storage, right? So it can't do anything with potassium. So then the next one we probably want to think about is phosphorus. I'm doing these in order of maybe easiest to answer to most difficult. So phosphorus. And you'll hear a couple different things said about this. One, does it increase the concentration of phosphorus in the manure, or do they claim that it makes the phosphorus more available at land application? And I'm going to distinguish those. So if you are trying to increase the phosphorus concentration in manure, well, there's no mechanism to do that, right? Whatever phosphorus was excreted by the animal is sitting in that manure storage pit. Our question is only, is it recoverable? So if we're going to increase the concentration in the manure that we remove, what I think we're probably saying is that if I go take a sample of that manure, it will have higher phosphorus concentration, which means less of the phosphorus is accumulated in the sludge, more of it's available in the liquid fraction, right? That essentially got worked up into the manure. It's possible to do that, right? It can happen, but it's not the only way to do that. You could say, you can tell me, it's really hard to agitate this pit, right? It's really big. But if you would have fully agitated that manure so that you didn't have sludge buildup, you would have got the same amount of phosphorus out of that manure, right? So it's not that you can make phosphorus, it certainly doesn't, but you can alter the particle size, the phosphorus solubility, to make some of it more easy to recover or harder to recover. In terms of availability of phosphorus, two things. One, on most manure fields, we're probably already relatively rich in phosphorus. I probably don't need to try and make my phosphorus more available. Unless you're low testing soil for phosphorus, there's no benefit from that. But if you do need your phosphorus to be more available for some reason, it's extremely soil pH dependent, which means I won't give you a recommendation about it. It could do that, right? There are ways to do that. For example, if I was an acidic soil, I'd try and lime my soil and make it more basic. So if I put my phosphorus and bound it to calcium, we know that you can make calcium phosphates, right, relatively easily in manure. We often do it by accident, might call it struvite or something similar. That would become more available when I put it in the soil, basically, as that's not stable at the pH that my soil is, right? So we can do it, but it depends on your soil pH, so I can't make general statements. The last one is nitrogen. Can it increase the nutrient value? This one, yes, right? We do lose nitrogen, depending on your manure storage, probably somewhere between 15 and 50% of the nitrogen that's excreted by the animal is lost during storage. So if you make a product that, for whatever reason, reduces ammonia loss during storage, yeah, you can increase how much is there. You could also just alter how available that nitrogen is, right? By reducing the amount of carbon I have. If I had the same amount of nitrogen in both cases, I could change availability. So they can on some products, but probably not all of them. Have I seen anyone add humic acid to liquid dairy manure? Any response, end stabilization, or consistency? I've never seen anyone do it personally. There is a scientist here at Iowa State. He actually works for USDA, but he does a lot of work with humic acids, and he's done some work with humic acids in manure. I wasn't present when he treated it, but he did see better nitrogen retention in the soil, is what he has said and published, and had some positive benefits. There's also decent work on adding humic acids to manure. Actually, I did add humic acid to manure. It helped reduce foaming when I added to it. That was the only thing I was studying. But they have seen that it can help reduce some odor emissions as well. You might have to add more humic acid than you're hoping to in order to see some of those positive benefits, has been my experience. Mostly it's a cost benefit scenario, right? So I think there is work that shows humic acids can be great. I think we're not sure if the humic acid response when you add that to the manure, if it's reducing ammonia volatilization because it's an acid, or if it's because it's working like an oil that clings to the surface and maybe changes some of the ammonia transfer properties. But there has been some work that says that. Do nutrient enhancing additives significantly increase the soluble P fraction? If so, a big concern for those of us in Ohio, Western, yeah. Okay, I do not think they significantly increase the soluble P in most cases, but again, it's mechanism dependent, all right? So if you're adding a microbial additive to the manure, chances are it doesn't change the soluble phosphorus fractionation enough. You're going to down some carbon. You might say, by breaking down that carbon, well, I should have less organic phosphorus. You probably will, but much of the phosphorus chemistry or the availability is related to what's it binding to in manure, all right? So there's a lot of things that phosphorus can stick to in manure. Manure tends to have a basic pH, so it tends to stick to things like calcium, magnesium, at least in my experience, and you'll make some precipitates. How big they are is debatable, but they're probably smaller than we generally want to be if we're trying to capture that phosphorus and separate it, but it can happen. I'm trying to think of a product where I might see enhanced soluble P fraction. I suppose if I had a metal salt that I added to manure, it would make an iron phosphate sort of particle. And generally that is low solubility, but if I would add it to a basic soil, right? So a soil that had a pH of 7.5 or greater, that would not be a stable compound in that soil condition anymore. And that would be a case where you could have altered the soluble P fraction. Generally, I don't think most products would increase soluble phosphorus. They'd have a much better chance of reducing soluble phosphorus. Products like Clasp in poultry litter, that's generally what's been shown before, right? That by adding Clasp, even though it's an acid, I actually make that phosphorus less soluble. Antonio Mallarino, a friend of mine here at Iowa State, did some work with litter amendments like Clasp, and that's essentially what he found, right? Adding alum, Clasp, other products like that, reduce phosphorus solubility at the time of application. So I won't say there can't be a product that does, but generally we went the other way and make phosphorus less soluble at the time of application. In the long term, I don't think you're changing phosphorus availability much with most of those. Now, if you were making an acid salt and throwing it on a low pH soil, that probably would be phosphorus that's relatively tied up or not available for long periods of time. But again, that's soil condition dependent. Do you know of a repository for evaluations of manure additives? I don't know any specific repository, but if you send me an email, I can send you both a link to the Iowa State study, an older Purdue study, and a more recent Purdue study where it was supported by National Pork Board, where they looked at a variety of products. I will say, probably to no one's surprise, that if you look at some of those studies, maybe some of those products are still available, but many of them come and go from the market more quickly than one would hope. So some of those products won't be around anymore.
Right on, Dan. Boy, you sure made my job easier just pulling the questions yourself there. I appreciate that. We do have a few minutes left here, and so yeah, couple things I'm wondering about. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about the economics, and those are obviously a driver. In the background, I'm always thinking about who's benefiting, from whatever product, who's getting the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've been involved in some cases where there's been neighbor disputes, for example, around odor. And so the neighbor wants an additive to reduce the odor. The farmer wants an additive to get better nitrogen use efficiency or whatever the case may be. So it's just interesting, the competing interests. And here in Ontario and in Canada, actually overall, our federal government is really driving a lot of work around because of greenhouse gas emissions and looking at, products that will reduce that. So anyhow, more comments about this whole who benefits?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect answer to that, right? We all want a product to do something, but sometimes we want it to do different things. And if you work in a pig barn where you might have neighbors who care about odor, I maybe own the barn, right? And I get the manure to utilize. I want better nutrient retention, and the person who owns the pig, the integrator, might want better air quality in the barn, right? So we're all asking for things that seem related, but none of us wants it to do exactly the same thing. And in each of those cases, you might say, well, if I'm using an odor control product, I either need the neighbor to pay for it, or I need it to reduce my lawsuit threat by enough to justify it. If I'm the crop farmer, I might say, improved nitrogen retention helps me out. I get to cover more acres. I should pay for it. And if it's better air quality in the barn, it should be the barn owner that pays for it, right? So how do we find situations where if there's multiple benefits, the cost is split? And maybe that's what we have to look for. But I agree with you completely. That is one of the challenges, especially if products get a little bit more expensive. And I suggest that some of them probably have to be as effective as we want them to be. How do we find the cost structure that works where everyone who's benefiting helps support that?
Absolutely. I'll direct you back to the chat then. You can carry on there. There's a couple more questions there for you.
All right, is humic acid a viable product for foam reduction? If so, what rate would you suggest in a hog pit? I did not find it a viable product for foam reduction in the little bit of work I did with it. I won't say it doesn't work, but I tended to lean towards Skyces as the product I was using to reduce methane emissions, which was most effective from my standpoint. And then it probably would help reduce or at least alter the surface tension of manure, which may or may not be helpful. And the reason I didn't necessarily like humic acid is when I put it in, it was great for something like 4 weeks, and I'd have to go back and look at my dosing rate. It was so long ago. After that, I got foaming worse than I started with. Not as bad as I did if I threw soybean oil in, but I still over time got worse foaming. I think some of that product might have chemical alterations while it's in manure, and if it starts breaking down into something else, it didn't do good things for me. All right, I had salads build up on the bottom of my pit and used a product called Manure Liquefier made by Farm for Profit. I think that it fixed the salads, but I didn't notice a major reduction in air quality. Has that been your experience with this product? All right, I've never physically tested this product myself, but I will say I was to a bunch of barns in southeast Iowa that use that product from Farm for Profit. They were the lowest solids content barns in terms of deep pit swine manure that I have ever seen in Iowa. And I don't think it's from increased water use. So for some reason, that product does seem to do something to me. And then in terms of air quality, if you weren't in a situation where you were getting a crust on your manure before, I think it probably won't be changing air quality noticeably in your experience, right? It probably doesn't change it enough that just by going to a barn, you say that barn smells better or worse. And the reason I say that is odor is funny. If you want to have a noticeable impact on odor, you need something like a 50% reduction in all odor compounds from that manure to go to the barn and say that one smells less smelly to me, right? And that's a pretty high bar to set. Oftentimes when I've done product testing or evaluations, I'll see something like a 20% reduction in odor. And we do that at our olfactometer. So smell it at different dilutions, right? And changes where you can smell it. But when I go to the barn, doesn't change what it smells like to me. Okay. So chances are changing odor is hard. We might get better on it. We had something on phytase. Phytase reduces dietary phosphorus needs for swine, and we think phytase continues to work in the manure storage. Does it continue to work in the soil to release available phosphorus? I have no data on that and am not qualified to comment.
Fair enough. Fair enough on that. And Andy's just clarifying in
Yeah.
his statement there.
So he didn't see better air quality. And I don't think you should expect better air quality. I would actually anticipate if you were breaking down solids, we probably are going the other way, right? So if you're breaking down solids, you're probably freeing up nitrogen. You're taking some protein and you're turning it into ammoniacal nitrogen. To me, that's always going to say you should get more ammonia coming off the manure. That should be more odorant, right? Now, does it change it in a noticeable way? Again, I'm going to lean towards probably not. Now, you broke down solids. You might say, yeah, but I know smell is related to carbon. And it is, but it's really related to slow points in the breakdown process. If we have a really effective processing, we start from, let's just say, organic carbon, and we get all the way to methane ammonia, and we didn't lose anything in between, hopefully we'd have no odor. Now, if you're breaking down solids, you've changed or increased the rate that we're breaking down some of that stuff. But if your slow point is, let's just say at volatile fatty acids, it's often the slow point in manure. We stick at volatile fatty acids longer than we want instead of making ammonia. You might have more volatile fatty acids come out. Probably not enough that the manure smells noticeably different to you unless you go with sorbent tubes and hold on to the volatile fatty acids on the sorbent tube and come back and measure them with a GC. But I think just because we're breaking down solids, having less solids in our manure doesn't mean that you're going to see an improvement in air quality. And I'm wondering if the reason you think that is, if I have a lagoon, right? And I had a lagoon that was, let's just say 5% solids and another lagoon that was 1% solids. You're going to tell me the lagoon with 1% solids smells less. And I would say, absolutely, right? I'll agree with you completely. But there's a competing interest there, right? So that's sort of using solids content to understand how carbon rich the manure is. In your case, you took one storage, added a product to it, and got some of that stuff to break down, right? So if I just look at two lagoons and say 1%, 5%, 5% should be smellier, it has more carbon loading in it. It's sort of a thermodynamic argument. I understand where I'm at in a point in time. In yours, you might say, well, I was 5% and I reduced it down to 4%. I should be less smelly. And maybe if you can maintain it at 4%, you'll be less smelly than you were at 5%. But the process of getting there, you broke down more solids, but you probably didn't do every step in the process more quickly. You did certain steps more quickly and made some odorants along the way that we missed or didn't miss. So it's really hard to make big changes there. All right, I think that made us to the end of our questions again.
That's awesome, Dan. I'm going to get, maybe you can stop sharing there, Dan, and Colin, you could put up the CEU QR code for this session. There's one nutrient management credit for certified crop advisors. But listen, this has been a great discussion. Maybe just a final comment, Dan. I'm curious in the future, like what's going on? Is this area exploding? Are we seeing all kinds of new products, new research, government dollars? Just quick comment on the future.
I don't think it's exploding. I think we continue to see new products. I tend to see them about the same rate we had. I think there is research that's occurring, especially on the microbial fingerprinting side, where we had extremely little data 10 years ago, where people are getting a lot better at it. And that might allow us to better target some of our products to achieve different things. Is not a place we see maybe government credits exploding currently, but as carbon markets expand, I think lots of people see potential if they could develop a product to reduce methane or greenhouse gas emissions, that there's money to be made or money to be had. And specifically coming out of California, you've seen few people working on this on the feed additive side to reduce enteric fermentation. Deep pits, manure storages aren't that different than a rumen in terms of the microbes that come from them. So that sort of thinking, that sort of logic probably would come to new products, new government availability, or at least new funding available to a farmer if we find products that we believe are effective. I don't think there's that. Manure is a great topic. It's my favorite topic. I don't think there's going to be an explosion of government funding to maybe support new products, but I think there will be opportunities in the market to help justify using them that haven't been there before.
Okay, super. I noticed you didn't mention beer as an additive, but we'll have to leave that for another time, I guess, to circle back to. But listen, Dan, want to say thank you. Appreciate it very much. This was a very detailed, very insightful presentation, and I appreciate the work you're doing. Wish you well as you continue in that work, and thank you for your time to join us. Everybody else, thank you for joining. And next week is our final session. We will circle back to composting bedded pack barns. And I expect we're going to have a good conversation. That's always a lively one. So we'll see you back here next week, same time, same place on March Manure Mondays. Cheers.